Welcome! My name is Jess Ledbetter, and I will be sharing information about the development of the Intentional Leadership Actions and Paraeducator Outcomes Survey, the ILA PO. This presentation will describe the process of conducting cognitive interviews to improve the validity and reliability of the instrument. As an induction coach, I mentor early career special education teachers during their first 2 years of teaching. One unique responsibility for special ed teachers is supervising paraeducators, the non-certified personnel who support teachers and assist students. You may have heard other titles for this role, including paraprofessional, instructional assistant, educational assistant, or classroom aide. Federal guidelines call for paraeducators to be, quote, appropriately trained and supervised, but few teachers receive pre-service training about team leadership skills. Despite the lack of training, team leadership in special ed is the most important factor for effective paraeducators. Special ed teachers in my district agree that team leadership is challenging. Paraeducators need regular training and feedback from an intentional leader. My doctoral research is targeted to enhance team leadership skills for early career special ed teachers in my district. A literature review revealed there is not a leadership survey for special ed teachers. Therefore, I created a quantitative instrument for teachers to collect data and reflect on their intentional leadership actions and paraeducator outcomes. This was the genesis of the ILA PO survey. On the ILA PO, participants read a series of statements and make a mark on a line. Participants can mark anywhere on the line between disagree and agree based on their level of agreement with each statement. This type of survey response is called a semantic differential. Compared to other measures like a Likert scale, the semantic differential provides response flexibility to detect minor nuances in changing participant perspectives. The ILAPO is designed for special ed teachers and does not require input from paraeducators. I made this decision intentionally to minimize potential harm to participants. Though paraeducator feedback is valuable, completing a survey about their leader might discourage honesty since anonymity is not possible on a small team. Further, it could create tension or expose feedback the team is not ready to discuss. The ILAPO is solely designed for the use of the special ed teacher to reflect on the influences of their intentional leadership behaviors. Paraeducator feedback should be sought from other data sources. There are 2 parts to the ILAPO. In Part 1, teachers rate statements about paraeducator outcomes observed in the classroom. You can read some examples here. In Part 2, teachers rate statements about their own intentional leadership actions. You can see some additional examples here. I designed the ILAPO survey by reviewing literature, reflecting on personal experiences, and considering stakeholder information from interviews, focus groups, and conversations with colleagues. Part 1 includes 18 question items about paraeducator outcomes. As you can see, participants make a mark on each line based on their agreement with each statement. Take a look at these questions. Part 2 includes 14 question items about intentional leadership actions. Take a look at these questions as well. In my future dissertation cycle, teachers will take the ILAPO multiple times to promote their reflection. Data will be shared openly with teachers as they make changes in their leadership actions and review the outcomes. The length of the line for each item response on the ILAPO is measured. This is the agreement measurement. The agreement measurement is divided by the total possible length of the line to find the agreement percentage. In this example, the agreement percentage is 67%. But before I could get to any of that, I was faced with a very important question. How do participants feel about the ILAPO survey and its questions? This qualitative study seeks to explore participant perspectives about the ILAPO. The research question guiding this study is, how do special education teachers understand and make meaning of question items on the Intentional Leadership Actions and Paraeducator Outcomes Survey? To answer this question, I turn to a practice called cognitive interviewing. Cognitive interviewing is a process to reveal the thought processes involved in interpreting a question and arriving at an answer. It's a qualitative method that examines the question-response process, specifically the responses and considerations used by the respondents as they form responses to the questions. This method increases reliability and validity when the researcher develops deeper understanding of question items. Essentially, cognitive interviewing reveals the thinking behind the curtain, giving researchers a glimpse into the participant's mind to understand their responses, perceptions, misconceptions, and decision-making related to question items. Confusion or a wide variety in responses is a sign that clarification and revision are needed. The theoretical perspective guiding this study was hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is a theory of text interpretation. As a method of text interpretation, the hermeneutical circle moves between parts of experiences and the wholes of experiences. Here's a diagram to explain the process. Circles of interpretation deepen understanding and knowledge. The hermeneutical process calls a researcher to be reflective, insightful, sensitive, and open-minded as he or she investigates layers of interpretation. Hermeneutics has evolved over time. Modern hermeneutical researchers believe that life and history are intertwined. Since we are shaped by our own experiences and world perspectives, hermeneutics is a reflective process to understand deeper meaning below surface-level understanding. The hermeneutical process is ongoing because there is always more to understand. One underlying principle of modern hermeneutics is the social co-construction of knowledge. The researcher and participants are often co-researchers working together to interpret and ask questions about text interpretation. In my study, I sought to understand holistically and cyclically participant experiences with the ILA PO survey, socially co-constructing deeper understanding of question meanings on the survey. My role was both co-inquirer and hermeneutical researcher. As a co-inquirer, I sought interpretation and meaning in the text through shared experiences with participants. As a hermeneutical researcher, I focused on the global picture and bigger meanings that were emerging from multiple shared encounters with participants. I will further explain this process later in the presentation. Here is an overview of the methodological design. These steps will be explained in greater detail. I followed an interview protocol that began with guided practice. The interview was guided also by the ILA PO. Participants read each question item and talked aloud about their thinking related to the question. I used paraphrasing techniques to increase my understanding of their thinking during the process. Participants read every question in Part 1 and Part 2 of the ILA PO following this process. Additionally, I was interested in their overall perspectives of the survey, including the directions and the connections they saw between the ILA PO and team leadership in special ed. After Part 1, I asked 4 questions about the connections between teacher leadership and paraeducator outcomes. You can read them here. Additionally, I was interested in overall opinions about the survey and its connections to teacher leadership. I asked 4 additional questions you can see here. I will discuss responses to these questions later in the presentation. Participants were selected from a purposive sample. According to Creswell, a purposeful sample is used to intentionally sample a group of people that can best inform the researcher about the research problem under examination. First, I interviewed myself by reading and responding to each question item from my interview protocol. I am a self-contained preschool special education teacher with 2 paraeducators. These parts and wholes of my understanding on the ILA PO documented my pre-understanding of the survey. Then I selected 8 participants to develop new understanding. Participants were a stratified, purposeful sample, intentionally chosen to illustrate subgroups and facilitate comparisons. A small purposive sample is recommended for cognitive interview studies. I selected 4 experienced teachers and 4 early career teachers in their first or second year of teaching. The sample included 6 women and 2 men, working with a variety of students, representing both resource settings and self-contained special ed settings. A selection of special ed teachers with a variety of workplace experiences informs the study because all efforts to interpret always take place within some background. Various perspectives increase the information to be gained. On average, interviews were 1 hour long. I followed the interview protocol designed for the study, conducting interviews in 2 cycles. During interviews, I used paraphrasing techniques to summarize participant comments, check for my own understanding, and engage in co-constructing meaning together. To increase the validity of the findings and my new understandings, participants were sent the final survey and presentation draft for member checking. Data collection consisted of layers that deepened my understanding. Layer 1 was my own pre-understanding collected when I interviewed myself. Layer 2 was each individual's initial response and reflection about each question item. Layer 3 was a co-constructed meaning as I used paraphrasing techniques to summarize their thoughts and check for my own understanding. This often led to deeper discussions of meaning. Layers 2 and 3 were captured when I listened to the audio and transcribed the conversation. Layers 4, 5, and 6 were constructed with hermeneutical analysis of transcriptions. Hermeneutical analysis seeks to surpass the initial understanding of the researcher or participants to achieve deeper interpretations and understandings. Some understanding was co-constructed during the interview. Other understanding was researcher-constructed through open reflection and repeated rereadings of transcripts in parts and Data analysis was an iterative process in which I moved through parts and wholes in the hermeneutical circle to construct new understanding. I read each individual's response to each question, the co-constructed meaning during paraphrasing of that question, and made notes about my own new understanding about the participants' understanding of each question. This created layer 4 of my understanding. After interviewing 4 participants, I constructed new understanding. I read and reread 4 participant responses to one question in the transcript and then reread my own corresponding reflections for each of their responses until no further meaning could be created. Rereading and reflection created a new layer of meaning, layer 5, that summarized my learning from those 4 interviews. This new understanding resulted in some immediate changes to some ILA PO survey question items, which I documented in my audit trail. After interviewing 4 more people, I repeated this process of repeated rereadings and reflection for each participant's response. Then I reread responses from participants 1 through 8 on each question item until no further meaning could be made. All the time, my understanding about each question expanded, creating layer 6 of my new understanding. I constructed global meanings about each question, made question revisions as needed, and documented changes in my audit. Hermeneutical analysis deepened my understanding of the parts and wholes of the ILA PO survey. Each layer of participant interviews, co-constructed meaning, interview transcription, and reflective writing about my new understandings contributed to my global perspectives about the ILA PO survey. The hermeneutical process of conducting cognitive interviews was very informative for the ILA PO survey instrument. Without the reflection and hermeneutics, it would have been challenging to see the flaws in the ILA PO survey questions and anticipate problems with question items. Yet, with layers of understanding co-constructed with participants, I was able to develop deeper understanding of the survey questions, gain insight, and correct flaws. The process offered opportunities for ongoing reflection. The work I did as a hermeneutical researcher influenced my ongoing interpretations during the co-inquiry process, which further influenced my hermeneutical inquiry in each cycle. Constructing new meaning was enlightening and slightly addictive. I would willingly continue this process with additional interview participants if time were unlimited. Getting back to the research question then. Hermeneutical cycles contributed to new understanding. New understanding contributed to researcher reflection. Reflection contributed to changes for some parts of the ILA PO survey and confirmation that other parts did not need modification. Globally, participants agreed that the survey was understandable. Each participant contributed a few ideas about items or aspects to change in the survey. This section of the presentation will share information about the changes made to the ILA PO survey. According to Willis, there are 5 possible categories of outcomes that emerge from cognitive testing. ILA PO changes fell into these categories: question item wording, addition of survey questions, changing terminology for one item throughout the survey, changing the formatting and wording for survey directions, reordering 2 survey questions, elimination of survey questions, and a decision to decrease cognitive challenge required to construct an average for multiple paraeducators on Part 1. These changes will be explained in the following slides. First, I will discuss global changes that can be seen throughout the instrument. During the ILA PO survey design, I decided to use the term EA based on our district's terminology. In reflection, I realized that this term should be instead paraeducator to align with my own overall research and a term that's more commonly used in educational literature. This change occurs throughout the instrument. During the social co-construction of meaning during interviews, I realized that conversations often focused on intentional leadership actions. This new understanding required a name change from Educational Assistant Outcomes Survey to the current title, Intentional Leadership Actions and Paraeducator Outcomes Survey. Based on participant responses to items in Part 1 about paraeducator outcomes, I developed new understanding that Part 1 should be completed for each paraeducator instead of marking a team average. Participants acknowledged that this would take extra time, but shared that it would be more meaningful and less cognitively challenging to complete. Therefore, I changed question item wording and directions for Part 1 to reflect this new understanding. Last, I clarified directions that were often skipped by highlighting them in yellow and adding a box around them in both Parts 1 and Part 2. Next, I will reveal some of the changes made to individual question items on the ILA PO survey. These changes will demonstrate some of the global wording changes as well as more specific wording modifications to question. Part 1 items relate to paraeducator outcomes. In the item about completing tasks, participants suggested clarification and also commented that few people complete the task exactly the same way. Revisions here clarified this question. In the item about new ideas, participants talked about how a person might be, quote, willing to do something, but passive-aggressively show resentment and frustration about the idea. Adding the word supportive was a participant's suggestion to improve the item based on what she desires to see. In the item about staying busy, participants discussed the innate traits of some individuals to be self-motivated workers. However, participants felt that this might be somewhat out of the control of the special education teacher. I revised the question with the expectation that a paraeducator with nothing to do should know to ask the teacher what to do next. This expectation can be taught, explained, and supported. In the item about leading classroom activities, the deletion of the word can was suggested by a participant who said that it should not be about paraeducator ability, but instead that paraeducators must jump in to do this when something unavoidable comes up. This is important for a class to continue without an interruption. In the first item about working with students with disabilities, participants thought very broadly about this question wording, wondering if their EAs would be successful working with all types of students. This was not the intention of the question. Rewording of this question focuses more on the paraeducator's approaches with students on their caseload. In the question about confidentiality, early career teachers often worried aloud if it was okay when their team talked about students with their colleagues. Clarification of this item suggests that it is okay for teachers to talk within their team, and that is true for confidentiality expectations in our district. This change will avoid misinterpretation and also avoid worry related to this item. In the first item about being the leader, participants wondered about their EA's internal opinions, which cannot be observed or assumed. Additionally, teachers talked about distributed leadership, downplaying themselves as the only leader. To improve this item, I clarified the observable behavior that the EA should still treat the teacher like the team leader. This rewording allows for distributed leadership, reflecting the fact that the special education teacher should still be the one who's guiding the team overall. In the items about roles and responsibilities, teachers demonstrated little differentiation in talking about roles or talking about responsibilities. Though these things are different, combining the questions still reflects an important quality that paraeducators should know their roles and responsibilities in the classroom. One item suggested when I asked about items to be added related to the importance of an EA being able to adjust strategies when it is clear that a student is not responding. This led to the addition of this item. Part 2 relates to items about intentional leadership actions. In the first item, I added clarification about the meaning and appropriate time to delegate tasks to EAs. In the initial version, this item wording confused a participant who was not sure about the meaning of the word delegate. On the item about training EAs, some participants were not sure how to quantify the word regular. My new understanding revealed that the word was not necessarily important, so I decided to eliminate the term regular from the question item word. The item that asked about being the primary leader prompted limited reflection from teachers and did not seem meaningful. My new understanding revealed that I should delete this item. Confirming and deepening my pre-understanding, teachers overwhelmingly agreed that paraeducator outcomes from the ILA PO could be controlled with intentional leadership. Here are some quotes from participants connecting leadership actions to paraeducator outcomes. Teachers found the survey easy to understand and flexible to their needs. In the quote here, the participant also commented on the flexibility of the semantic differential line. Also, the ILA PO promoted teacher reflection about team leadership. In the quote here, the teacher talks about how the ILA PO influenced her leadership goals. One very significant finding from the cognitive interviews was that participant responses were significantly situated in their own leadership beliefs. For example, some teachers talked about their leadership philosophies, such as the belief in co-leadership instead of viewing themselves as the primary leader. Other participants talked about modified professional expectations, such as allowing their EAs to carry their cell phones during the workday because they have kids. Participant responses were strongly based in leadership beliefs and varied between participants. Responses were also situated within their own team context. For example, some teams have little time for staff meetings, so they have impromptu meetings when necessary or possible. In the question about regular team meetings, participants responded to this question based on their own definition of meeting, rather than a dictionary definition of a sit-down meeting with an agenda. Cognitive interviews revealed that participant perspectives and experiences will influence their responses regardless of clarity in question items. Leadership and team dynamics are based on personal qualities of team members. Therefore, participant responses on the ILA PO survey should not be directly compared between participants because each participant will respond to questions from their leadership perspective. Therefore, the instrument should be limited to comparisons of the same participant over time instead of comparing item responses between participants. Thank you so much for viewing this presentation. Here are references related to the methodology discussed. You can find more information about my other research cycles and view a final ILA PO survey on my website.